Good evening. Sorry for my weakened voice. I'm recovering from 3 months of double pneumonia.
Oh, wow.
But it was too important not to be here.
Glad you're feeling better.
I'm sorry?
Glad you're feeling better.
So far, so good. I'm Rich Borrasso with SARGE, Sussex Alliance for Responsible Growth. We are an allied member of the Sussex Preservation Coalition, also known as SPC. SPC is a nonprofit organization of nearly 20 allied organizations and about 5,000 followers. Our focus is on advocating for more livable communities for residents throughout Sussex County. We're here to provide comment on the proposed perimeter buffer amendments. Since the development design launch, SPC formed a team to inform, to engage the public in the development design review process and the pathway to more livable communities. Team members have professional experience in municipal planning, landscape architecture, county, state careers, and natural resources, including forestry. Miles? Public recognizes the county's efforts 14 months ago to launch a review of the potential updates of the county code in reference to development design. The public interest in the workshop was overwhelming. Overflow, 2 separate meeting rooms in the process. People turned away. Most viewed this as the most significant effort on behalf of the county in decades in terms of the review with a pathway to potential changes. Testimony centered on particular outdated and inconsistent land use codes, open to interpretation, and what appeared to be deficient county enforcement. In fact, much of the illustration showed, at minimum, loose interpretation to full range violations. There was genuine dialogue regarding potential corrections and fixes, but there was a lack of any discussion on how the improved standards would contribute to an overall vision for a more balanced, orderly approach to future residential development. In the most recent, one of the more recent Cape Gazettes, there was a cartoon. And the question was asked, which image best describes proposed buffer regs? A good step in the right direction, low-hanging fruit, too little, too late. My opinion, it is a combination of the first two. A good first step. Focusing on perimeter buffers will address low-hanging fruit, and I don't think it's ever too little, too late if we can work together in the process. Now, understanding there were no objections to possibly citing a historical fact earlier with Mr. Hutt and Mr. Robertson, I do want to make a couple comments with regards to what led us to where we're today. The Commission and the Council were asked independently to review a summary of idea table to identify their priorities. Public was not informed of the process, although it appears that it might have been the low-hanging fruit approach. Too many approaching it on a one-off basis could be short-sighted because each category is independent of one another, or interdependent upon one another. And what I mean by that is the category of site work determines where the building site is. What remains is a minimum percentage of both passive and active open space. Tree preservation is contained in the open space, including perimeter buffers. Essentially, perimeter buffers is a subset of tree preservation. Subdivision standards, including superior design, define the regulations and potential disincentives and incentives. A piecemeal approach likely runs the risk of amending the amended from each separate category review and the potential waste of county staff time and resources. However, this is where we're at. One of the key takeaways is that similar to neighboring jurisdictions, the county would be best served by adopting the concept of requiring a conservation plan that accompanies the site plan that addresses the categories in more holistic fashion. Every single bordering jurisdiction references a conservation plan that accompanies a site plan that deals with open space, tree preservation, and natural resources. If I can ask the Commission permission to keep the record open so that I, for your convenience, can provide you with the purpose statement that speaks to the conservation plan for each of the neighboring jurisdictions. It is one paragraph for each to include Conservation Act of Maryland, the Kent County Woodland Preservation Ordinance, as well as Newcastle. So I'd ask that the record be kept open. I'll immediately send that this evening. The approach you will hear repeated throughout the document that we are submitting for the record is comprised of 14 combination of comments, as well as additions, modifications to the existing proposed amendment. I have that document here, if I can approach. Right, this is something that's separate. We will not be commenting this evening on all of the comments and recommendations. SPC development team member Steve Sinclair will be highlighting just a handful of those comments. And so at this point, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Steve Sinclair. Steve, again, is a SPC Design Development Committee member. And with that, if I can ask Steve to approach.
Okay. Boy, that's good to start the clock over again for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Rich. And thank you,
Thank you.
Council Member. My name is Steve Sinclair. My wife Susan and I live on 30726 Beach Club Court in Millsboro, Delaware. We moved down here and we just love the mix of ag land, woodland, forest fields, and farms. It feels like home, even for an old Vermonter. I retired after a 42-year career with the Vermont Department of Forests and Parks. The last 16 years, I was the director of forests. And just as an aside, my wife was the executive director of the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission. So we come from a planning natural resource background. I want to commend the Sussex Planning and Zoning and County Council for the work that you've done so far on tackling these issues. It's really a step in the right direction, and I think it will have a lasting impact on the quality of life of all the residents of Sussex County. But this is also an opportunity for bold leadership on your part. You've opened the door. Now this time is to seize it and really look at the natural resources of Sussex County and start trying to plan for their conservation and use. As Rich said, we're not going to go through all of our comments, but I want to highlight on a few of the proposals that we're looking at in changing the ordinance. The first one is line 29, and what we're suggesting is that we really need to add a whereas. If you think of the existing perimeter buffer standards, the existing code, we were really talking about just planted trees. But you've opened the door now to preserve existing woodlands. And those existing woodlands have a myriad of values and benefits, much beyond screening. And this is an opportunity for you to articulate that in the ordinance, talking about flood mitigation, soil erosion, improving air and water quality, wildlife habitat, recreational opportunities. That really needs to go in the ordinance. You need to identify what those values and benefits are. And if you think back of Chapter 115, resource buffers, you've done that. You've articulated what those benefits and values of those resource buffers are. That should be in this ordinance as well. Line 38. Recognizing in the proposed code that you're going to be looking at all these benefits and values. And as Rich mentioned, we really think it's time to require a conservation plan. In the resource buffer ordinance, you talk about a natural resource plan. In your county overall plan, you talk about protecting natural resources. How can you do that if you don't know what they are and you haven't come up with an idea how to manage those over time? So you talk about a perimeter buffer landscape plan. Why not broaden that to be a conservation plan? So when the developer is doing his development design and his site plan, accompanying that comes a conservation plan. You've opened the door because now you're requiring a forest assessment. But just counting the trees is not enough because we know there's more values than just the trees themselves. There's habitat, there's soil erosion, there's other things going on in that woodland that need to be recognized, evaluated, and the strategies put in place to maintain those over time. Brian mentioned about a woodland. You just can't leave it alone. It needs to be managed over time. These perimeter buffers that are going to be retained are going to be need to be managed over time. You're going to have disease, dying trees, hazard trees that are going to need to be removed. You're going to have invasive species coming in that's going to need to be managed over time. So why not require a conservation plan in place that would articulate all those values and benefits? So line 157, we need to expand that forest assessment to not just look at the trees, but all the natural resources within that area. This is going to be so valuable when you start looking at open space. We start thinking about where on this parcel should be setting aside open space. Knowing what is there is the only way to do that. Let's see. Line 218, the state forester for Delaware Forest Service, I think went on the record, or at least spoke at the Sussex Preservation Coalition when it was asked, what would be an adequate buffer width? And he said 100 feet. In my experience, a minimum buffer width, in order for the trees to maintain their over time from wind throw, sun scald, and to provide some of these natural resource benefits beyond just screening, need to be at least the width of the average height of the trees. So 100 feet, yeah, that's quite a bit. You know, we recognize that's going to have an impact on the development, the width of the trees. We're recommending 50 feet as a minimum requirement to at least start to maintain some of those values, wildlife habitat, soil erosion, flood mitigation. So expanding that from 30 to 50 feet, we think is the right idea. Line 239. Expand the perimeter buffer protection area to be applied to resource buffers. So in Chapter 115, you have resource buffers, but you don't require the perimeter buffer protection area on resource buffers. If we think they're important for perimeter buffers, they're equally more important for resource buffers when you're talking about water quality issues as well. So we're recommending that you need to go back to the resource buffer code to include that as well. Line 307, changing, first thing I want to mention is the fact that I also serve on the Delaware Urban and Community Forestry Council, which is a advisory group to the Delaware Forest Service. There is a list of recommended tree species, recommended trees put out by the Delaware Forest Service. I request that you keep the record open so that I can submit that for your use.
That would be great, because they said there wasn't a good list when we reached out to them. So
we're recommending that the mix of tree species go 60% deciduous and 40% evergreen. The reason for that is when you think about it, an evergreen tree tends to retain their branches lower. It's more dense. It's going to provide much more screening. Additionally, the canopy size of a conifer tree is less than a deciduous tree. When you're requiring 15 trees for 100 feet, you're going to have canopy overlap. We think a mix of 60-40 would work out better. Line 363, applying no disturbance language to the perimeter buffer protection area. So I apologize for pointing it out, but it's our reading of the proposed ordinance that nothing can take place in that protection area. No tree cutting can take place in the perimeter buffer protection area. But there is language that in the perimeter buffer you can't do any grubbing, hoeing, or removal of soil. We think that that language should also be included in the perimeter buffer protection area as well. And finally, line 373, and this goes to Mr. Butler's comment as well, relating to mitigation. So the developer comes in, they remove woodland, they have to expand the size of the perimeter buffer. We're also suggesting that that additional acreage that they plant, it needs to be at a higher density of number of trees per acre equal to the existing basal area that's present of trees. Any forester would be able to explain that to you, but I'm running out of time. Finally, Rich started off with a cartoon. I'm going to end one, and that is we're asking a lot of these buffers, but they can provide a lot of benefits. I think if you look at amending this ordinance to expand upon that, we're going to be able to have buffers that provide more than just screening. Thank you very much for your time.
Right, sir, we thank you.
That was fabulous. Thank you.
and I would also add, it's really helpful to have. And I know that, folks have started doing this, just line by line suggestions rather than sort of broad-based comments, because it's much, broad comments are obviously helpful, but this, then you can take a look at, specific language and whether it makes sense or not. I think it's just a lot easier for the commission and staff.
So maybe if we leave the record open, we could provide the opportunity for them to condense it into line by line.
Well, they've done it in here, so yeah, we're
Okay.
good with this. That's what I was saying. Having this was really helpful.
Oh,
So,
okay. I
yeah,
thought
that
it
was
was
my
like-
point.
I'm fine with
Yeah.
leaving the record open to receive additional information, but both
No doubt.
Borrasso mentioned
doubt.
as well, so there's nothing wrong with any of that.
No.
That's fine.
No, I can't wait to read that paragraph.
Yeah, okay. Okay, who's next? All right, we'll go right here, and then, ma'am, you'll be next, okay?
How do I advance this?
What's
Do I
that?
advance this? Button
Yeah.
all right on this? Oh, well, he's got to get it up first.
You're looking at me like I know how to do the technology. You're the wrong person.
You're asking the wrong bunch up here.
Put that right out there.
Good afternoon. My name is Jill Hicks. I am Vice President of the Sussex Preservation Coalition. I live in Chapel Green, Lewis. First and foremost, thank you for your work on perimeter buffers and the other county initiatives. This effort will go a long way to providing the quality of life residents hope to enjoy. This work will move Sussex County closer to creating livable communities. I want to make clear that my comments are not repetitive and certainly not in conflict with Rich and Steve's presentation. I agree with and endorse everything they presented. My comments are in concert with theirs, providing real-life observations gathered from around the county and pertinent to this ordinance, and can improve residents' quality of life now and into the future. And as always, I do have copies of my statement for each of you that I will distribute afterwards, and do have line item additions for you.
We're not going to penalize if you didn't have line items.
First, I applaud the inclusion of perimeter buffer protection area. This will help protect the trees that remain in the buffer for the betterment of everyone on both sides of these buffers. Oh, look at that. I had an arborist come from Complete Tree come inspect the trees on our property because one was looking sickly. He said it is fine, but we should keep an eye on the trees closest to the property line for several reasons: new exposure to north winds and the danger of wind throw, damage to the root system during the clearing, and soil compaction during construction. He said sometimes it can take 6 years or more for a tree to succumb to that kind of trauma. This tree fell behind our neighbor's house in heavy winds at the end of February this year, shortly after the perimeter drain was installed. The perimeter buffer protection area is needed and appreciated. I ask that you recommend strengthening this ordinance protection by clearly stating that no disturbance of soils or clearing of trees can take place. So for page 11, lines 362, 363, which we've already talked about, we should add that at no time shall the ground within the woodlands area of the perimeter buffer and the perimeter buffer protection area be cleared, graded, regraded, or grubbed. To further demonstrate, the left side shows the buffer between our fence and the silt fence. The initial clearing took place in January of 2023. On the right side, it's now the second time the root systems are being disturbed and cut. This was March of this year. I am standing at my fence, and you can see how they excavated right up against the perimeter line. A perimeter buffer protection area would have been beneficial here to keep that disturbance and root damage back. That tree that I showed you earlier fell shortly after this work. To further justify extension of the perimeter buffer, I'm going to go on because you already saw this one, protection area, the clearing of entire woodlands destroys natural habitats that are necessary for everyone's health, safety, and welfare. If we continue clearing large wooded areas that are habitats to native insects, amphibians, fish, and animals, we will destroy the balance of nature that sustains us all. By tearing down woodlands, we created dislocated forest fragments that deprive all native species access to food, water, and interactions they need to thrive, not to mention the clean air, clean water, and biodiversity that we depend on. No one thrives in a sterile environment created by lawns, macadam, and rooftops. Replacing forest with lawns and macadam creates dead zones. With the extension of the perimeter buffers and the perimeter buffer protection area, we have a better chance of providing the wildlife corridors needed for everyone and everything to thrive. Audubon International states that many species of birds, even when migrating, will fly out of their way to follow wooded corridors rather than fly straight across open fields. Protecting the perimeter buffers is a move in the right direction for every reason. These pictures were taken from inside my home. These geese and goslings and fox were just on the other side of that silt fence, not at the same time. Next, we need to protect our personal migrating patterns and the positive impact wooded buffers have along our roadways. Vinyl stockade fences and berms do not provide screening, nor do they add value to the county's quality of life, nor do they create livable communities for area residents. These homes in Lewis Crossing were built and occupied prior to Redner's and the Redner's gas station. Here's what these residents are living with now. They asked me to drive back here at night. So this is during the day, that's night. That's from the in between two houses. These lights are blinding at night. This is a perfect example of harmful light pollution. It not only interferes with migrating birds, it is not healthy living. It is not healthy living conditions for humans. A stockade fence will never block this light. but trees will. Some of these homes have taken to filling their backyards with newly planted conifers, but not everyone can afford that or can afford to give up their backyards, nor should they have to. When looking at a site plan on a piece of paper, it is difficult to fathom all the positives and negatives that will come with it. That's why we need ordinances and codes that will protect citizens from this type of pollution. Berms will not and do not provide adequate screening and add no value either. Studies show that forested roadways have a calming effect. This is John J. Williams Highway traveling southwest beyond the fire station. Then along came Beach Plum Preserve. This was all woods along John J. Williams Highway, all the way down to Angola Road. Now it's lined with continuous row of vinyl stockade fences, and not a single tree was replaced. This is Red Mill Pond, all stockade fence, no trees. This is Kindleton, houses built right up against the stockade fence, which is right up against Cedar Grove Road. How many of those trees do we honestly believe will reach full maturity up against a fence like that? A wooded perimeter buffer could have and should have remained here. The county needs to look ahead and decide what it wants to look like and be for its residents and visitors. I am not suggesting that we ban stockade fences. What I am advocating is that we not allow forests to be cut down and then replaced with stockade fences. Stockade fences can be installed within the property line or on the line, but not to the exclusion of the required forested perimeter buffer and the perimeter buffer protection area. Page 14, beginning at line 462, needs to read, quote, may include landscape and design features such as fences, walls, berms, landscape plantings, so forth and so on. I think that's a legal term. But never to the exclusion of forested or planted perimeter buffer and its perimeter buffer protection area. Earlier in this draft ordinance, it states that the perimeter buffer is to go around the entire property. The county should adhere to that, including along adjacent roadways. This slide was taken from inside my home. The project manager for this development said that we will not see them building back here for another 6 to 8 years, depending on the market. Therefore, I live with this abandoned destruction for 6 to 8 years or more. Then at some point, construction will begin. We now have the ability to correct these unsuitable living conditions for others. We need to strengthen page 14, beginning with line 475. Quote, clearing of trees in an area should not be permitted in a phase until the developer has received permits for that particular phase. A current resident should not have to live with a clear-cut area and construction debris and the lack of a buffer year after year before the clearing of that entire forest. I rarely heard traffic on Robinsonville Road nearly a mile away as a crow flies. Now, all day long, I hear the backing up of heavy construction equipment. That woods would have blocked that noise pollution as it always had. I know the Planning and Zoning Commission and Planning and Zoning staff takes a lot of criticism, and it's my observation that most people are not familiar with the process or that Planning and Zoning doesn't write the codes, but is charged with following them. Now you have the opportunity to have a say in what codes you are charged to follow in your decision making. The county is off to a good start. However, no one knows what enrages county citizens better than you. This is your time to make recommendations to council for the betterment of the county. Again, thank you for taking up this work. There is a lot of good in this ordinance, and I think we're off to a good start. Let's bring balance to the county. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Right on time. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good evening. I will try to keep this quick. My name is Katie Gillis. I'm the Executive Officer of the Home Builders Association of Delaware. We are an association representing 375 members that are builders, remodelers, and developers statewide. I'd like to thank you for keeping the record open. I was going to request to do the same thing. We will submit a detailed letter with some technical comments that are better addressed through writing.